All right, happy Friday evening, everybody. I'm here tonight with Charles Bobertz, professor of theology, New Testament and patristics at St. John's University School of Theology and Seminary in Collegeville, Minnesota. Charles, if I remember correctly, you completed your dissertation at Yale, and you wrote it on, was it Cyprian of Carthage?
Yes. Cyprian of Carthage.
What was the topic?
I think the title, if I could remember this far back, the title was Cyprian of Carthage. I can't remember the title. It was a study in the role of the bishop in the context of the practice and participation in patronage in the Greco-Roman Empire. So what I did in that dissertation was to place the function of the bishop within the giving and receiving of patronage as a way of establishing honor and authority within the Greco-Roman context. So basically, it was an argument that the Christian institution of the episcopacy was moving into the world of Greco-Roman patronage that carried it forward and obviously into the period of Constantine, where it really became part of Greco-Roman imperial patronage. So that's what I was working with. It was not theological. I've since become theological. I really was interested in social history at the time because I was very much influenced by Ramsay MacMullen, who was a social historian, and Wayne Meeks, who had been working in the social historical part of the development of early Christianity. You remember Wayne Meeks's book, The First Urban Christians. Well, that was just happening when I was at Yale, so it was quite the interest to be interested in social history.
That is such an important book. The first person I had on here, John Kloppenborg, as you know, does social history and the New Testament, and his most recent book, Christ Associations, you could really see the influence of Meeks's First Urban Christians, where Meeks is trying to ask the question, like, who were these early Christian communities? What was their makeup? What were they doing? And he applies different models, the Greco-Roman associations, the synagogue, philosophical schools, I think he looks at, and he seems to kind of settle with the associations as perhaps the strongest model.
Right.
You know that your book is important when you have, maybe 20, 30 years later, you have a collected volume of essays dedicated to it. I think there's one that just came out not too long ago, after the First Urban Christians, I think it's called.
Yes. It was, well, it's always been an important work because it just directed our attention and to my mind to a completely different way of looking at the subject of Paul. It's a subject of the context of Paul's writing. So it was groundbreaking for sure.
Which kind of is a segue here, because you went from patristics, which is probably the high point of Christian theology. Let's just, state the obvious fact, to the study of the New Testament.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, some might see that as a little bit of a demotion.
Well, one of the things that has been most influential in my work is the fact that the artificial discontinuity between the study of the New Testament, the New Testament being a canonical theological artifact, and the study of early Christian history, which is not that. So that the way that the academy was essentially organized, even when I was in graduate school, was you would study the New Testament sort of sui generis as a one thing, as an artifact, and then you would look at early Christian history or patristics or however you want to say as another thing, right, as a separate study. And I found it to be untenable. I've always found it to be untenable. The late books of the quote New Testament historically are at the same time as the books that we usually put into early Christian history, the earliest of those books. If you follow the work of the latest work on the Gospel of Luke and the dating of the Gospel of Luke into the early 2nd century, it strikes me that that's the time of the letters of Ignatius. I mean, so, the overlap is obvious in terms of an historical study. And then theologically, it's also overlapped. It's not as if Ignatius as a theologian has any sense of being separate from, 2nd John as a theologian in terms of the period of the early 2nd century.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think your book is actually a pretty good way to address this continuity. Thinking of the way you situate the liturgical reader of Mark, which would have been, I think you said, so Mark is thought to have been the earliest written gospel, if I remember from my New Testament courses. And I think somewhere in like the early 70s, so probably not long after the destruction of the Second Temple.
Exactly.
Which is one of the crucial issues going on that you bring out throughout this book. So your reading of the Gospel of Mark from the context of the liturgical reader of it, the 1st century reader of it, kind of forces us to read Mark with a bit of theological reflection. So it's kind of find like New Testament with early Christian theology. So I just wanted to kind of, that's what I got out of reading it. One of the things I got out of it anyways.
Well, yeah, I thank you for saying that. But the premise here is the world-forming power of liturgy, the world-forming power of ritual. I got into this by noticing that very few people paid much attention to the power of ritual, the power of liturgy, especially in terms of social formation. And that's where it links up with the study of the social formation of early Christian groups. The power of liturgy to create a worldview out of which something like a narrative would be written. And so that's the starting point, right? The starting point is to say, what if? It's kind of it's kind of like you always have to say that, right? When you start a study of a particular text and you're imagining, what the starting point would be, how you are going to approach the text, and you're always putting something, you're always having to have a presupposition to begin that study. And my sense was that very few people begin with the idea that the early Christians are very powerfully formed within their cultic groups, powerfully formed in terms of a worldview, and then that the worldview is what's manifest in the narrative. So the second thing that happens in my book on Mark is the idea that Mark is, and this is not my idea, this is, what you would find in many, many studies of the Gospel of Mark at the present time, but it is a created narrative, right? So it's not, the memories of some secretary of Peter or anything like that, but it is in fact a created narrative. And then to put that together with the fact that the worldview that creates the narrative is generated by participation in the early Christian liturgical setting of the Lord's Supper, and then to do a reading from that position. That's both an historical supposition to suppose that the early Christians were formed within the worldview, were formed within the social and the powerful. I'm messing this up. The early Christians are formed within the world forming place, right? The worldview forming place of liturgy, and it's out of that reality that's being created in a sense by ritual activity that they then produce the narrative. So that's an historical argument. What I did in the book was not just that, that was the foundation of the book, but was also to make the claim that we now today, formed within a ritual setting, so I'm talking now about uh, liturgically centered traditions like Roman Catholicism, Anglican, so forth, right, that they have a powerful sense, especially of the Eucharistic liturgy, that they would also benefit by paying attention to the power of the ritual to form their understanding and reading of the narrative. So it's also a modern person's presupposition coming into the text.
Yeah.
So I'm doing two things. I'm making two sorts of claims. I want to say that it's always a legitimate reading to read from a modern position of liturgy. Um, but I also want to make an historical claim that we haven't paid enough attention to the world forming power of liturgy in the formation of narrative.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how it
Yeah, you,
goes.
you see, you bring this up a little bit. Some of the traditional historical critical works on the New Testament, one of the criticisms that I frequently see is that some of those discussions were rooted in Protestant Catholic debates,
Yep.
about, a pure form of, Christianity that emerges from the synagogue versus, the corruption of Plato and Hellenism and this and that. But
Harnack.
another problem I think is that today we've been formed in a very rationalistic society, where symbolism and thinking liturgically almost comes as a very foreign concept to us.
Yes. Yes.
So
yes.
let's take a good look at sort of the liturgical symbolism of Mark and what that
Okay.
tells us about the early Christian liturgy and what it tells us about, our experience with the liturgy today. So the heart of your argument, you say in the prologue, is that one reading of the Gospel of Mark is that it is fundamentally a presentation in narrative form of a theological rationale in a time of communal crisis evoked by persecution for Gentile and female inclusion in the defined ritual space of the Lord's Supper of the house churches. Thus, the narrative presents a theological argument similar to that posed by Paul in Galatians. You make this point, I think, a couple of times in the book where you bring up Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Jews ought not to back away from eating the Lord's Supper with the Gentiles, which is really the main theme that underlines, that kind of underpins your entire book, is this conflict within this Markan community about what place Gentiles have at the supper, at the meal.
Yes.
And that it seems so striking that meals in this time were such an important part of a group's identity, and
Mm-hmm.
there were ways in which groups would use it as an opportunity to kind of show their inclusion and exclusion.
Yes.
So you're seeing here, and you draw this, using the Jewish disciples as almost a model, so to speak, of the kinds of Jewish Gentile tensions in the Markan community in which Mark was situated.
Right.
Talk about that a little bit, and how did you have that revelation? That's a very interesting observation.
Well, I'm hoping it's a fairly obvious observation. We'll see how that goes. But one of the things that within the narrative of Mark, I mean, you look at certain narrative features, and one is people refer to the opaqueness of the disciples, their inability to understand that they're painted in a bad light as narrative characters. And so what I tried to show, and I think I can show this, that's why I wrote the book, and I'll continue to press this, is that Mark has a narrative sense of the disciples, the intimate group of disciples, as Jewish. And so the question is, what is going to be their attitude about the inclusion of Gentiles? And that, I argue, is precisely the point of their opaqueness, their lack of understanding in the narrative is the lack of understanding that Gentiles are a part of this new eschatological space called the Lord's Supper. So I just kind of go through and try to thoroughly point out that you can show this, that this is what they misunderstand within the narrative. So again, I'm just trying to tie the narrative into the actual situation that Mark is reflecting. That Mark, Mark is arguing for the legitimacy of a particular understanding of an eschatological space. Does that eschatological space include Gentiles and women? Or does it not, right? And that I think that the narrative shows that he presumes that there's resistance to that idea. So Mark paints a clear, in my mind, he paints in the narrative a clear theological argument about what the Lord's Supper actually is, what constitutes the reality of the Eucharist in the Markan community. And I think that, that's what you have to listen for at that point is where's the resistance to that idea? If you look at Galatians, for example, and you read Galatians 3, there's resistance to that idea. Obviously, Paul's harangue in the first 3 chapters is to declare that, what is the gospel, right? For Paul in the first 3 chapters of Galatians, well, it is the inclusion of the Gentiles, right? The final argument that he makes after those 3 chapters. And if that's the case, then he's obviously within that, as he presents the argument, there's obviously resistance to that. So I'm just looking at that setting in which there would be resistance to the inclusion of the Gentiles and women, I'd like to add, in terms of the narrative structure of Mark, to that eschatological space.
Chapters 2 and 3, you draw that out. So you look at 2 medal narratives.
Yeah, when the most interesting thing that I think I started with, when you kind of look at this as a project and say, how do other people read the Gospel of Mark? And then can it be read differently from this perspective? And one of the things that struck me as absolutely just crazy was this almost universal acceptance of chapter 9. So in the Gospel of Mark, in chapter 8, you have Peter's confession, right? The, you're the Christ episode. Almost everybody takes that as the fulcrum, the climax, the pivotal moment in the Gospel of Mark. And it's almost as if, right, you could just, I'm going to say this baldly here because I'm getting old. It's almost as if you have the declaration of the Reformation right there in the middle of the Gospel of Mark. And that declaration is, you are the Christ. So it's the center of the Gospel of Mark is the proclamation of Christ, right? As a kind of center of Mark's theology. Well, I began to ask the question, what does Peter mean by that? What should the reader think that Peter should understand by that statement, given that the reader has been taken along to this point in the narrative? And that's those 2 meals that come prior to that, right? So in chapter 6 and chapter 8, we have 2 Eucharistic settings in which the central moment of both, I try to point this out, is that the inclusion of the Gentiles, first in a hidden way in the first feeding narrative, and then in a manifest way in the second feeding narrative. You're moving from that which is hidden to that which is revealed, which is a theme that is, perfectly situated in chapter 4 in the parable chapter of Mark. And it strikes me that is what I mean, at least I'm making the argument that that's the way that one can understand what Mark is up to in revealing what Jesus as Messiah is actually all about. What is his messiahship? What is the inbreaking of the eschatological age in the Eucharistic meal? And it would be this inclusion of Gentiles and women.
Yeah, I found that so fascinating and quite persuasive. And you bring it out. That informs how you interpret much of the symbolic narrative of Mark. So
Yes.
in the first mission to the Gentiles, so in chapter 2, you start with the story of the crossing of the sea, and that sea is taken as a figure or a symbolic of the waters of chaos. You know,
Yes.
and then Jesus is walking on that water. He's calming the chaos. He's bringing order out of that chaos. So you got this collapsing of time that you keep bringing up in your book that's taking place at the liturgical gathering.
Yeah.
But here, I just want to read this quote and then kind of have you talk a little bit about it, because I thought it was very interesting. And this kind of helps to situate how this first century reader probably would have encountered this story. The journey begins on the same Sabbath when it is evening, Mark 4:35.
Mm-hmm.
Here Mark draws on what is perhaps the earliest Christian understanding of the death and resurrection of Christ as the eternal continuation of the Sabbath day. That is the seventh day and the final triumph of God's act of creation over the forces of primeval chaos, darkness, and water. So he's dominating the chaos and he resurrects, he rises up into the boat. So you have all this kind of imagery that's merging together. You got darkness and chaos being overcome by order, by Christ. But you also have the baptismal imagery of Christ coming out of the water, which is almost the necessary prerequisite for calming the chaos, for defeating the chaos. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, so I read Mark chapter 4, and there's lots of elements to this, but in Mark chapter 4, the first thing to notice is that you have water between a Jewish space in the Gospel of Mark, right? Galilee, that you're crossing the water to a Gentile space, the Gadarenes, at the beginning of chapter 5. And there's chaos in between. So that's the sort of setup, for this narrative. And then in the narrative itself, I argue, you have what is obviously a baptismal scene. And that the understanding of the resurrection of Christ out of death, right, which is in a sense already established in Mark chapter 1, right? You have the baptism of Jesus, out of which comes the resurrection, right? It's clear that that's the way that Mark wants to begin, that the resurrection of Jesus Christ comes out of the death of Jesus Christ. That is a baptismal scene in chapter 1. Then I take chapter 4 to say, then that's in a sense a reenactment of the death and resurrection of Christ, and I try to point out that the linguistic setting for that is perfectly in tune with that. Mark alludes to this as resurrection in the narrative itself in chapter 4, and that then establishes the warrant, if you would, right? The death and resurrection of Christ is the warrant for the mission to the Gentiles. And there are really interesting details in chapter 4 that almost no one pays much attention to, that can kind of confirm this understanding of the narrative. The one that makes them, most people wonder about this is the fact that Mark mentions that there are other boats.
I
with the boat of Jesus,
so
right?
Interesting,
And they fade from the narrative after that. You never hear from the other boats, but they're apparently also going through the storm, right? And if the other boats that are with him which is a really interesting way that Mark says that the other boats were with him,
Mhm.
when you would suspect that sort of a natural way of understanding that would be that the other boats were with them because Jesus is with the disciples
Yep.
on the boat,
Yep.
but they're with him,
Mhm.
and they're crossing the sea with him. They apparently go through the same storm, right?
Mhm.
So one could argue they go through the death and resurrection of
Yep.
Christ, um, along with Jesus and the disciples, in a sense, in the narrative. And that's what leads to the mission to the Gadarenes, to the Gentile mission.
Yeah.
And it's powerful enough. The death and resurrection of Christ is powerful enough to break the chains of the Gadarene demoniac, right?
Yep.
The new strength, the new power, to break, the bonds of chaos that would prevent this new eschatological reality. So it's one of the most interesting, narratives in the entire Gospel of Mark. But I do think it's the first of three boat scenes
That's right.
that show that.
Mhm. And it leads to a really interesting reading of the pigs. So
Yeah, right,
the little piggies that go wee 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 all the way down the hill,
right. Yep.
Um, and from that, what I was thinking is you're making this point here that this chaos that's in the way of this eschatological community, this heavenly kind of banquet, which is really this new community that emerges of Jews and Gentiles dining together, men and women dining together.
Right.
Um, but for this early reader, this first century liturgical reader, that would have had real connotations for their lived experience of the conflict that's going on within the community. And you
Yes.
connect the little piggies that go wee 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 with perhaps some of the ritual purity laws that were kind of a source of some conflict. That was a very interesting observation.
Yeah, you have to imagine that there would have been, you know, really intense moments over what's going to be the food at the table fellowship. Um, and so there might be, I guess I allude to the idea that, this also would have been part of the liturgical setting. I mean,
Mhm.
what what foods will be allowed, in that setting, and why would they be allowed, and what is going to be how is this going to work? How are Jews and Gentiles going to eat together in
Mhm.
this new eschatological setting? Once you've established, and I think the main thing here, if I could just make this point, I mean, it strikes me that Paul's argument is really, if I could shift over a second,
Mhm.
Paul's argument is really about baptism as the way that the Gentiles enter the community,
Mm.
as opposed to circumcision,
Right.
as the rite of entry.
Mhm.
And that all of this, oh, this, all of these intense arguments about what works are,
Mhm.
right? Um, my sense is that centers around the idea of whether or not circumcision is the entry point to the community, and that Paul has this sense that it's baptism, and I think Mark has this sense that it's baptism.
Mhm.
And then the question is where is the center of that power that's able to create the eschatological space? How is that moment understood that breaks chaos,
Mhm.
that breaks chaos, that forms creation out of chaos?
Mhm.
So the original moment of creation out of chaos, a understanding of Genesis as the creation out of chaos. And I'm very much influenced, as you know, by John Levinson's understanding of creation out of chaos. That's the world being formed. That's the new creation, if you would, that's manifest in the resurrection, necessarily formed out of chaos, necessarily formed out of the power of the baptismal ritual.
Mhm.
Um, and that's how I look at the role that water plays,
Yeah.
not only in chapter 4, but also in in chapter 6, as
Mhm.
you know, and when
Yeah.
Jesus dominates chaos again,
Yeah.
walking on the water.
Yeah. The question I had reading your account of these is, I mean, at this time, there would have been Gentile converts to Judaism.
Yes.
That's correct. So what kind of emerges here then is a community debating on how to handle that particular problem. And so if this Markan community was saying, no, baptism is the way, and you point this out several times, the hodos, the way that is
Yeah.
being prepared, then that would have been grounds for the synagogue to kick this Markan community out. Is that accurate, or?
Well, I think it could develop to that because if you make the strong claim that circumcision is no longer necessary for entry into the community, whether that be Jewish or Christian,
Mhm.
there would be many Jewish communities that would reject that, right?
Yeah,
They would say that you've just crossed a line. And
yeah,
you have to think about, in terms of community identity, where is that line? And every community has that line that if you cross it, you're out.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I think that was the line,
Mhm.
most likely in the Jewish Christian context. So you wouldn't have something called Christian churches yet. The
Yeah.
Jewish version, right? The Christian version of Judaism at
Mhm.
that point in the Second Temple, something like that.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
the various answers to that question. I'm not making a claim that there was some unified that there were not some Christian communities that would
Mhm.
have said, sure, you have to be circumcised. I'm absolutely sure of that.
Mhm.
I'm just saying that the Markan community is one of those following the Pauline communities
Mhm.
that say, well, no, you don't have to be circumcised, but you do have to be baptized.
Right.
That's the point of entry
Yeah.
to this. And then that centers if you think about it, that centers the importance of the death of Jesus
Mhm.
into the narrative.
Mhm.
And one of the striking things about the Synoptic Gospels, right, in the context of the larger range of gospel literature in the first and second century is the centrality of the passion narrative, the
Yes.
centrality of the
Yeah.
death of Christ. So, to wonder why that is theologically so central. And if it's at the center of how they understand the power of God to create resurrection from chaos that's expressed in the ritual of their baptism, right? That they actually enact that power, then it strikes me that that's why the narrative of the death of Jesus would be front and center.
Yeah.
And just getting away from how much of it is historical, et cetera, et
Mhm.
cetera.
Mhm.
I don't think you can even you talk about that until the cows come home, as we
Yeah.
used to say.
Mhm.
But I do think that that's why it would be located at the center of the narrative structure of the Gospel of Mark and the other three synoptics. So it's a liturgical rationale.
Mhm.
And this is getting back to the idea that if you presuppose that the
Mhm.
rituals that the early Christians practiced, the immersion and the waters of death, right? The death of Christ as a ritual entry into the community, and the practice of a meal, which was the inbreaking of the eschatological age that was realized. I mean, realized sacred space, and the power of that.
Mhm.
And then you think about, well, then what's the narrative?
Yeah.
I think you have a whole different set of eyes.
Yeah.
Um,
You know, as I was reading this, especially your chapters on the passion narrative, and this your attempt to kind of get into the mind of the liturgical reader, I kept thinking about the Christians in Bithynia. I think it's Bithynia, right, where Pliny the Younger was,
right, right.
um, and what how they would have thought. So let's jump to Barabbas, for
Okay.
example. Okay, Barabbas, the insurrectionist
Yes.
that the crowd, this crowd that you point out had welcomed Jesus into the city, now turns against him. And
Yes.
they demand that Pilate release Barabbas, this insurrectionist.
Yes.
Keeping in mind now that this community knew very well the results of the attempted Jewish insurrection against the Romans, which is devastating.
Yes.
What they would have thought, what this community in Bithynia would have thought, reading that story, just having had a governor come in and torture, and I think he even killed a couple of their members, if I remember from his letter correctly.
It's this kind of casual, they deserve to die because they were obstinate,
because of the name, I mean, that's kind of what emerges. And there's so many interesting things about the exchange between Pliny and Trajan. One thing, is that Pliny was sent there because people had been distributing these pamphlets, that were making accusations against this Christian community.
Right.
So you have people, their own neighbors, turning against them, which is something you bring up, in this book.
Yes.
Like, in some ways, Peter's, as much as he's the one who says, you are, the Messiah. He also failed miserably when it came down to the wire, and he rejected, and so he kind of becomes this literary figure for perhaps some Jewish Christians in this community who would have defected in the face of persecution. But just thinking, like, what would...
Well, I think that's really an important part of the context of the Gospel of Mark, and every time you work on something like this, I have so many things that I wish I would have expressed, had another chapter on, or I should have worked into the argument. But the context of the persecution of the early Christian community, I think, is pervasive in the narrative of Mark. I think that's the sense that, I mean, just think about what we were just talking about in chapter 4 and the crossing of the sea. You have the Jewish community with the disciples and Jesus on one side in Galilee, and they're about to cross to the Gadarenes on the other side. And in between, there's chaos. And I don't know how you read the idea of chaos being the way that what happens when you do this mission is that you find yourselves in chaos. So there is no doubt in my mind that the Markan community associates the mission to the Gentiles, proselytizing, with resistance to that mission. The Roman authorities or Jewish authorities that come down with persecution for that very effort, for the proselytizing. I think that the mission of the early Christians, at least for the Markan early Christians, meant that that's what brought on persecution. And then the question is, well, is God's power to overcome that, right? Or is the power of Christ as resurrected enough to overcome that?
Right.
And so Jesus rises from the waters of chaos in chapter 4, right, prior to entering into the Gadarene mission. And the answer to that is yes, right? You have the power of resurrection. You have the power of new creation. You have the very existence of this eschatological community now formed out of that very persecution, which kind of comes dangerously close to what Tertullian said, right? That the martyrs are those that, in a sense, create the church. But I really do think that it's part of the larger context that I did not pay enough attention to.
No, but it's a very fascinating question, because when you read the story at the beginning of the Passion, or not at the beginning of the Passion, but when they demand that Pilate release Barabbas, and then we know what happens to Jesus. If you think about, like, situating yourself within these communities, like you're in Bithynia and Pliny had just come and tortured a whole bunch of your friends, you wonder, like, what would I do, if I were, in that crowd? Would I be demanding Barabbas, and say death to the Romans, or or would I, accept to pick up the cross?
Yeah.
That had to have been a very difficult question for.
Well, we have somewhat of an answer to that came out of my first work that we started this conversation with, the Cyprian of Carthage. When the persecution came to Carthage, it's quite clear from Cyprian's letters that most of the Christians succumbed to the demands of the Roman imperium. Right? They either got a hold of a libellus, bought it, or made it themselves. These were the little certificates that said I've sacrificed, and or fled, and or I mean they basically they were apostates. I mean the majority were probably apostates. They probably didn't go through with it, which meant that the ones who did, right, in that setting in the middle of the 3rd century became immensely powerful in a sense in the Christian community, because they're the ones that stayed the course, and they had so much power because they stayed the course against the Roman officials that they even challenged Cyprian's power, right, as a bishop in that setting. And most of Cyprian's career is establishing his power and authority vis-a-vis the power and authority of what he calls the martyrs and confessors. So apparently martyrs are people who suffered a bit more than the confessors, but in any case, those people who had suffered for the faith. And in the course of doing that, of course, he says that the sacredness of the eschatology, the sacredness of the space of the Eucharist, is under the aegis of the bishop, right? So that there is, there is no martyr who is outside the church. That's one of his famous lines that people know Cyprian for. And I do think that there is a real sense of where does the power lie? Who has the control? Who has the authority? But we've gone to kind of a drift. But to get back to the Gospel of Mark, what's the reading of that? What's the reading of why people are willing to be persecuted and die if they do not have a sense, and we haven't talked about this, if they do not have a sense of the reward, if you would, of physical resurrection. One of the things that strikes me about the narrative of the Gospel of Mark, it's constant emphasis on not just the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if you sort of go through and then you think about the fact that you have to back up and say the figure of Jesus Christ in the Gospel of Mark is already resurrected. In the first baptismal scene, he comes out of the water, he's proclaimed Son of God. That figure is already the resurrected Christ. And what he does, for example, in the cure of Peter's mother-in-law, is to grasp her hand and resurrect her. Right. And what he does with the little girl in chapter 5 is to grasp her, right, to touch her, grasp her, and resurrect her. So it's quite clear that Mark wants you to know as a reader that this resurrected Christ is the physically resurrected Christ, which fits, right, the sort of theme of that sensibility in the early Christian church. But in the context of martyrdom, right, if I'm going to physically be tortured and die for the faith, is that necessary, right? Is the physicality of that necessary? And do I get that physical reward? Does God restore my body, so to speak? I think that's exactly what, for example, Ignatius of Antioch is saying, right? That he's willing to suffer physical torture because God will restore him physically and matching the physical resurrection of Christ. And I can't imagine that his argument or his sense of what he's doing would make much sense to him unless that were there. So it's really an interesting sort of part of the context.
When you talk about the healing or the physical resurrection of Jairus's daughter, and the healing of the hemorrhaging woman who'd been hemorrhaging for 12 years. you make this point very directly. This is about the body. And I
Yeah.
started to think, because I think it's in the letters of Ignatius, if I'm not mistaken, that they're dealing with this problem of Docetism.
Yes.
So was this whole thing kind of like a spiritual apparition? Does the body really matter? Is
Yes.
that something similar to what's going on in Mark? Are they dealing with these similar debates?
I think that's exactly what's going on in the Gospel of Mark, and this is a contrary reading, right? That I don't know many folks who have worked on Mark who read, for example, the walking on the water the way that I do, right?
Yeah.
So you all remember the setting. There's the Jesus walks out to the disciples who are struggling with chaos, right, in the water,
Mm-hmm.
um, and they at first, when they see him, they think he's a spirit,
Right.
right? The phantasma in the Greek,
Yep.
right? A phantom,
Yep.
a spirit entity, and that's really upsetting,
Mhm.
right? And you have
Mhm.
to think about, why would it be really upsetting to these disciples that Jesus was a spirit,
Mhm.
as opposed to Jesus, flesh and blood, part of creation, physically physically resurrected.
Mhm.
And my guess is that Mark is trying to communicate, um, sort of I would put it this way, an anti-docetic sense of who Jesus Christ is. He's
Mhm.
physically dominating chaos,
Mhm.
and it's a physical resurrection.
Mhm.
And Mark makes that point that he gets back into the boat with him, and there he is. He's not a phantom; he's physical.
Mhm.
Um, once
It,
again,
that's so interesting. And you brought up this point. I've never picked it up before, but Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, you say it's
yes,
a clear allusion to Plato's Timaeus.
I think so.
And I
I'm
thought,
actually following Gordon Lathrop on that. I have to give him credit
yeah,
first. If he listens to this,
I
he'll
had never
chide
thought
me
of
if
it
I don't.
before, but I mean, it would make sense. I mean, I'm sure that's probably the most popular philosophical myth of creation of the
Oh yeah,
time. So
yes.
this whole notion of, Docetism, Platonism, the
I
body
yes,
doesn't.
absolutely. Part of the most interesting things, one of the most interesting things about my work and where I sit, right? So remember, you know, again, I'm interested in not the discontinuity between the New Testament texts and the early Christian texts, but the continuity, historically, like that's all of a piece. I don't, I'm not acknowledging this as a theological category in a sense as I do my work. And one of the most interesting things that I've come across is the idea that, well, you can't have something that was in the early second century, right? So if you look at the letters of Ignatius, if you look at the letter to the Smyrnians, for example,
Mhm.
and you could make an if you try to make an argument that Ignatius is not worried about docetic Christianity, right? Again and again and again, it's the reality, the physical reality of Christ, right? That's the argument that Ignatius is making. And he's clearly alluding to the opposite argument that Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, is not physical, right? That there is no physical resurrection. Um, and all of a sudden, I don't know how this happens. You have scholars who can say, well, there's no relationship between what Ignatius is saying about the possibilities of Docetism in the early second century and the Gospel of Mark, which is 40 years prior, right?
Mhm.
As if 40 years is this chasm
Yeah.
where we couldn't be concerned with similar sensibilities that are inspired by the the power of a Platonic
Yeah.
worldview in the early Christian experience.
Yeah.
And it just right with the recent work, my best friend in since we went to grade school together, Stephen J. Patterson,
Mm.
teaches out at Willamette University. Um, Again and again and again makes the, I think, convincing argument that the Gospel of Thomas is as early as any of the synoptic material that we have, at least a vast majority of the sayings within the Gospel of Thomas. Well, if that's not a Platonic worldview, then
Yeah.
I
Yeah, that's
can't
right.
I can't help you,
Yeah,
right? And
that's right.
that's earlier than the Gospel of Mark. So
Yeah.
clearly the idea that Mark could be concerned with a Christology based in Platonism, which would lead to what we're calling docetism, the idea of the non-physicality of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Sure. I mean, how could you make that? How could you say that that's not possibly?
Yeah. And
part
for
of that
anybody
context?
who says, that the Gospel of Thomas was suppressed and, some kind of conspiracy to withhold information or censor people, they obviously haven't read the Gospel of Thomas. If you read it, you probably know why it wasn't included in the canon of the New Testament. It's pretty bizarre.
Yeah, well, it's obviously early. I mean,
that's right.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a different part of the Jesus tradition. And what I think it's important for folks to realize is the Gospel of Thomas is a theological interpretation of Jesus. The Gospel of Mark is a theological interpretation of Jesus. The Gospel of Luke is a theological interpretation. I mean, you got to get this sense, right, that the narratives themselves present not primarily an historical memory of Jesus, but a theological interpretation of Jesus. That and that there are people who are resisting that. Obviously, the Gospel of Mark would never have been written unless Mark thought it necessary. Right? He's just, one of the dumbest things that I encounter in my reading is the idea that, well, it was getting late in the first century and the apostles were dying off, so they figured that somebody better write this down. That is just simply an outrageous sense, not outrageous, but just dumb. It's just dumb. I mean, the Gospels were written because whoever the gospel writer was coming out of a particular community was confronted with what they thought was a false understanding of Jesus Christ that they had to counter in narrative form. And that's everywhere. There would be disagreements about the understanding of Jesus Christ. And if you're looking at that as a modern Christian, right? And I'm a Roman Catholic. I'm an ordained deacon in the Catholic Church. I'm inside here.
You're with the Benedictines.
I'm with the Benedictines. I mean, if you're looking at the Gospels as a theological argument, the question is, do I agree with the theological argument? It's not anything else. I mean, that's, and I happen to agree with Mark, the way that I've read Mark. But the idea that it's a theological argument about the reality of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that is the reality that Catholics refer to as the real presence, right? The true reality of the Eucharist is the eschatological space. It's sacred space. It's the inbreaking of the world as it should be, all those ways that you could describe this. I mean, that would be the Roman Catholic understanding of what the Eucharist is, right? The sacredness of that. So,
it's interesting because, I don't want to knock popular piety. I think people who have devotions, in some respect, I'm actually kind of jealous, that they've got a pretty strong faith, and it helps them. But Eucharistic adoration, one of my theological concerns about it is that it kind of restricts the real presence to, this tiny little object, that even though it has been the Eucharistic prayers have been said and the ritual has been conducted, but to just limit the presence of Christ to that wafer that sits, on the altar that people come kneel, it seems to me to somewhat miss the point. And I think you bring it out implicitly in your book that the real presence isn't just the bread that they're eating, but it's the community that's gathered together.
Yes.
Is that an accurate kind of depiction of what you're drawing here?
Yes. And let me try to be as clear as I can. The idea that what's at stake in the materiality of the bread in the Gospel of Mark, and we haven't talked about this, but I'm also making the argument that the resurrected Christ is present in the bread the loaf in
The
the
one
narrative
loaf,
of
yeah.
Mark, the
Yeah.
one loaf.
Yeah.
And that one loaf constitutes the creation, the restored creation of the resurrection, right? So that what that is the gathering of Jews and Gentiles and women in this new space of creation that is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So there is no, here's the thing that I think people miss. The argument is over whether that is real. And when people say, well, is it real? They're asking, I don't know, something in terms of modern terms. Is it what we say it is, physically, according to the chemicals or whatever that, understanding of literal and real would be?
Transubstantiation, yeah.
Transubstantiation, something like that. I think that what Mark is saying is that if you have that loaf, which he's talking about, that gathering, the body of Christ, which is what that moment is, you have the material manifestation of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is the new creation breaking into the world, that you have the purpose of time and creation itself manifest in the gathering of Jews and Gentiles and women, this unheard of combination, right? This scandalous gathering is in fact God's intention for the creation itself. And so if you go back to what you were saying, John, if it's just about the bread itself without what the bread actually represents in the inbreaking of the eschatological age, without the manifestation of the community, right, gathering, then I think you've missed the point entirely.
Yeah.
And that's what I would say, or that's what I fear. But let's back up a second. To put all your eggs in the basket of the adoration of the Eucharist as a thing in and of itself without manifesting anything else, seems to me to be pretty close to Platonic. Seems to be pretty close to, it doesn't represent the materiality of the inbreaking of the eschatological age, which is manifest in the community and in social justice and all these things that are part of this new creation in the world that the church is.
Yeah.
So I guess in the way I would say this is that if you adore the Eucharist without seeing the church, and the church as being the manifestation of God's justice and God's purpose for creation itself in the world and our participation in that, you've made a category mistake. So I don't discourage people from these devotions, from popular piety. I always want to bring them back to, what is the purpose of this? What is it you think that you're doing? If you don't become, if you're intensely interested in Eucharistic adoration and you don't become a better Christian in terms of your social responsibilities as a Christian, in terms of what we think the purpose of our lives is in Christ, you've made the mistake. You really have missed the point.
Yeah.
So as long as those two are brought together in terms of the way that, I don't know, the adoration community operates, and that's constantly reinforced in the preaching and teaching of the church, I'm fine with it.
Yeah. It's interesting, that this notion, two of the concepts, the one is the order from chaos. So you have the darkness and the light, you have the chaos from which creation emerges. But thinking within the entire story of salvation history, the economy of salvation that is sort of outlined in dramatic form in the biblical text from Genesis to Revelation. One of the things that Origen kind of debates in Contra Celsum is, when did the people of Israel become God's people? And I think in that text, if I remember right, I could be wrong, but he settles on the conclusion that it was at the dispersion of tongues, the Tower of Babel.
Mhm.
In his homilies on the Psalms that have just recently been discovered, he actually points that out and he says, but I was wrong. And I think he situates it within the Exodus when God leads them like a sheep. But anyway, so you got this theological debate about, like, God's people. And in this drama of salvation, this is all very extemporaneous, which is why it's kind of incoherent right now. But your book has got me thinking about it. The first meal narrative, you've got the loaves and the fishes, which then eventually become the one loaf.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, if the cross and at the liturgical assembly, this inbreaking of the eschatological reality, this new creation, isn't supposed to be somehow kind of a restoring of the original unity of the human species before it became divided, before there was chaos. It's just something no idea.
I think that's exactly what's happening. Here's what's fascinating about it, right? So that if you think about the sort of the original community in Genesis, Genesis 1:27, God created a male and female. So you have apparently a community that is consisted of male and female and no other markers, right? There's no Jew, Gentile, anything, right? And so it strikes me that would be the paradigm, right, in terms of how the early Christians understood what they were up to. How Paul understands what he's up to is establishing that primeval community prior to the story of Israel that leads to the election of Israel, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things to remember about that is that the purpose of the election of Israel is to bring people back to Genesis.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. So I think that's the early Christian claim, is that that's done now in Christ, right? That we've been brought back. And of course, the Jewish argument obviously would be, no, it's not through Christ.
Right.
So there you have it. There would just be basic disagreement.
Yeah. The one question I still want to get in before we end, there's a whole bunch more, but we just don't have time. The one question I want to get in is, so within your hermeneutic of Mark, you've got these debates about the place of the Gentiles at the meal. You have the cleansing of the temple, and and Jesus kind of having the temper tantrum in front of the fig tree, oh, you don't have any fruit, so damn you, you're not going to bear any more fruit. And you say that's kind of the symbol of the end of the temple period, like the temple's not going to bear fruit anymore. You hear this term a lot, and I have very mixed feelings about it. Supersessionism.
Yes.
Is that what's going on here? Was this Markan community supersessionist?
I don't think consciously. I think they're making us an argument about, where we are now in this new community of Jews and Gentiles. But I can't say that, we don't have, Paul's argument in Romans to help us about the relationship between the final gathering of the Jews with the Christians. So I guess I don't know. But
your book and the tensions that emerge in this community between the place of the Gentiles and the place of the Jewish ritual laws has me thinking, the whole conversation about supersessionism, in my opinion, is really a postmodern kind of reading of Jewish Christian debates, at this time. And I think it often gets used as a weapon to just criticize these early Christians for kind of being, the precursor to colonialism and domination. And I think that kind of misses the complexity of what was going on at the time. I don't know. That was something that I was thinking about while reading your book as well.
Well, that's interesting. One of the things that I say to my students is that the early Christians thought that what was gained by participating in the community of Christ was the fulfillment of time and creation.
Mm-hmm.
And what that meant in terms of all of what we think about as the sort of the social work of the early Christian community to take care of the poor. I mean, that's the thing that is so striking about these early Christian communities, is the way that they took care of each other, right?
Yeah.
That they established the kind of community that was, a community of love and care for each other.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of human community is the fulfillment of time and creation.
Mm-hmm.
And what I tell my students is that is also what the Jewish community would say, right? So that the fulfillment of Torah in the Jewish community is that kind of community.
Mm-hmm.
So what I think the tragedy is that they ended up hating each other instead of realizing their common ground, which is that they're both making arguments about the way that the human community should be in the world, reflecting God's justice and compassion.
Yeah.
And if we can hold to that, that means that our ability to talk with our Jewish brethren and others within the world of secular and other religions is that if we do it on that basis, and especially, and here's the thing that I think is the most striking, sort of the deepest understanding of the Christian community, it finds itself moving toward the cross. If you look at the narrative of Mark, we find ourselves moving toward the cross, and it's only through the cross that there's anything that comes out of that in terms of the new creation.
Right.
So while we're a part of the eschatological space of the new creation, the only way that we get to that space is complete abnegation, so that the most important verse in the Gospel of Mark for me is Mark 10:45. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That attitude of deference in our journey to the cross means that we cannot be anything other than willing to die passively, and not kill actively. I think
you're right. Yeah, you bring it up in your chapter, on the Passion. It's like they're saying, if you're the Son of God, get yourself down off there. And you said by this time in the narrative, this community is figuring out why he couldn't, or why he didn't.
He has to stay
off the cross. That's right.
Right.
And they're realizing that.
Yeah. And it's this great mystery, isn't it? That out of chaos and death, God creates. And I often preach on this, that there are times when we find God only out of the chaos, only in times of those great moments of loss. And the large part of that is how God is brought to us by the members of the community, by those who pastorally love and care for us at those times. So I think that there's deep truth here, right, in the Gospels. As I said, I agree with them theologically in a profound way. So, yeah.
Well, I couldn't think of a better way to end this wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Here's your book, The Gospel of Mark.
Still available.
A liturgical reading. It is still available. Baker Academic.
Yeah.
Great book. Very interesting. It took me back to the days when I was taking patristics and Intro to New Testament with you, and All your
Thank you
lectures
so much.
on the collapsing of time and chaos and new creation was great.
Well, it's been a privilege of my life to have students like you and all of my students who come to us. I just feel as if I have been given a gift that I could never repay. So thank you for this conversation.
Yeah, it was wonderful. All right. Thanks. Have a good weekend.
Okay, thank you much, John.